Welcome everyone to Wednesday Night at the Lab. I'm Tom Zinnan. I work here at the UW-Madison Biotechnology Center. I also work for the Division of Extension here at UW-Madison, which used to be called the Division of Cooperative Extension. And on behalf of those folks and our other co-organizers, Wisconsin Public Television, the Wisconsin Alumni Association, and the UW-Madison Science Alliance, thanks again for coming to Wednesday Night at the Lab. We do this every Wednesday night, 50 times a year. Tonight, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Matthew Edney. He's at the University of Southern Maine, and he's also here with UW-Madison. He'll tell you more about that joint project there. He was born in the United Kingdom in London, SW19, otherwise known as Wimbledon, which is where they play cricket, croquet, tennis. Okay, I think it's both lawn tennis and croquet club. He went to high school at Kingston Grammar School, which was founded in 1585 during the reign of Elizabeth I. He went to the University College London for his undergrad and studied geography and land surveying. Then he came here to the University of Wisconsin-Madison to get his master's degree in cartography. He stayed to get his PhD in geography. And then from here, he went to SUNY Binghamton on Long Island. And then from...
Not on Long Island.
Stony Brook. I misheard you. He also... I apologize. I have made a mistake. Wherever Binghamton is, he went from there to the University of Southern Maine, which, as he said to me, is in Boatland. And I thought, where's Boatland? And then he said it again, and it's in Portland. So my hearing and my geography aren't very good tonight. This is one of the great things here about UW-Madison, the History of Cartography Project. His specific title is the world's oldest map really a map? This is personal to me because I am a neighbor of the folks who started this, David Woodward, who died in 2004. This is Roz Woodward. She's still my neighbor. And I've been trying to get somebody from this project for the last 10 or 12 years. And it's a great pleasure to be able to welcome Matthew Edney to Wednesday Night at the Lab.
At the risk of insulting everybody from Binghamton, I've always thought of Binghamton as the armpit of New York. If New York City itself is your belly button, and this is Buffalo out here, there's Binghamton. It's a great city. Before I forget, way back where Tom is standing right now, I've got some goodies. I have a little brochure about the project if you're interested. We have some bookmarks, because yes, we believe in books, not digital stuff. Postcards, very nice postcards, and little stickers, perfect for putting on laptops and giving to kids. Just don't stick them on your kids. Right. So what I want to do today is talk very briefly about the History of Cartography Project, but rather than expound at length about new ways of looking at maps, I thought I'd just give you an example. And it's the kind of work that's been very much prompted by the books of the History of Cartography Project and everything that's been accomplished by that. The project itself was founded by these two fellows, Brian Harley and David Woodward. They collaborated around about the time with the bicentennial of Declaration of Independence. And a bit thereafter, in 1977, when David was visiting Brian in southwestern England, Brian says, we need a 4-volume history of the mapping of America, thinking about the work they'd done together. And David shot back, no, we need a 4-volume history of cartography. And so when they began this plan, 4 volumes totaling 1 million words, all to be done by 1992. and the Columbus Quincentennial. That was the idea. But the thing is that they started asking their authors, their contributors, to think not just about how maps are made and the techniques and the science and instrumentation and processes, but also how maps were used and why they were used and who by and in which cultures. And when you start asking those questions, thinking about maps as instruments for social institutions and as cultural documents that carry meanings, not just location, but some kind of symbolic significance, then the subject matter just explodes. So we have finally volume 1, published in 1987, dealing with mapping in prehistoric, classical, medieval, Europe, Mediterranean worlds. Volume 2, well, they also realized that they needed to add a couple more volumes quite quickly, and they thought, let's add a volume number 2, make it number 2, on traditional Asian mapping. And they said, I distinctly remember when I first met Brian in 1983, and he said, yeah, we just decided to do this. It's going to be fast and small because not much has been done on Asian mapping. And pretty much we end up with 3 books, each bigger than volume 1, which is already bigger than the allocated size. Which then leads us into volume 3, the European Renaissance, which was David's own volume. So my first job when I took over the project was to wrap this project up and get it through the press. This one clocks in at 1.3 million words all by itself, just because the fun information that's being gathered when you start looking at maps in interesting ways means you just can't cut it out. You've got to say it. For various reasons, which are too long to go into, Volume 6 on the 20th century came out in 2015, mostly because Mark Mominier, the editor, is a Stakhanovite, if you know that phrase, workhorse. He just will push that one through. Volume 4, which I'm co-editing with Mary Pedley from Michigan, is coming out, they say, in November 2019. And that will leave just Volume 5 on the 19th century to be prepared. And we hope, well, I'm saying 2023 there, we're going to spend the next 2 days revisiting the actual workflow on this project. So to figure out who's going to do all the fact and reference checking and the editing and all the rest of it and when. So we'll figure out when that comes out. One of my favoriteest maps from the 18th century. So we will have a launch party for Volume 4 at some point in the spring semester when we know we will physically have books that people can use. These books are a million words. They take time to get through the press. So there's a couple of sheets for sign up if you want to drop your email down, and we'll let you know when we will have the party in the spring, probably late March, early April. Right. Oh, yes. And I persuaded the University of Chicago Press to put all these books online for free access. So running up through December, we've had 3.35 million downloads of chapters from 1 through 3. And Volume 6 went online in July for free access. That is a different structure, so it doesn't mean much to say chapter downloads. But that's being downloaded, and 4 and 5 will be online as well, 2 to 3 years after print publication. So it's having an effect. So my case study then for the rest of the talk is about this image and why it's being considered the world's oldest map and why it may not be. So if you ask most people who deal with maps and map history, what is the oldest world map, they're going to say this thing. This is from Volume 1 of the History of Cartography. And you find it in Casey's philosophical study of the representation of place, and you find it in a picture of the original mural, in an account of reinterpretation of Babylonian mapping, even though that mapping takes place several millennia later than this image. This is a mural from a place called Çatalhöyük, if I pronounce that right, in south-central Turkey. Here it is on a nice Google map. It's a very flat part of Anatolia. This is looking north from the tell of Çatalhöyük, looking north to the mountains. And then this is from the north looking at the eastern mound. Sorry, this is going to be from the west. No, this is from the east looking at the eastern mound. So it's a classic sort of ancient settlement where the settlement over time has built up the ground, and so you're left with this mound rising up above the plain. The kind of things that archaeologists love digging in. From above, you can see the main eastern mound with a small western mound. There are a couple of structures there which are hiding current excavations and the museum. And here's an oblique aerial view. Now, this site was first dug by an archaeologist called James Mellott, worked for the British Institute of Archaeology in Ankara. And he did a preliminary dig in 1958 and then did more in the early 60s. Some scandal, which, to be honest, I don't understand, ceased work, but Ian Hodder, a very famous modern archaeologist, began work there again in 1993 and is still working, proceeding apace. This is what the excavations looked like under Mellott, and you can see a variety of walls made out of clay brick. All of the walls all the spaces seem to be private structures. There are no large public buildings, no large spaces, and there are no roads, for reasons we'll come to. Overall, it has 18 different layers, ranging from about 9,500 years ago to about 7,500 years ago. So this place was occupied for about 2,000 years. Yes, I can do my math. And at any one time, the estimate is it had between 5,000 and 7,000 people living there. So this is a Neolithic site, which means it's still Stone Age. Mostly it seems to have been a central location from which people went out to farm. And beyond that, I'm not an archaeologist, so I can't get into the economics of this place. This is part of the recent excavations under Hodder. And you can see several layers here. And again, the way that the houses are also built on top of each other. This is an element of one portion of the archaeological plan of what Mellott's team dug in 1963. And you can see in crosshatch lines the walls around each of these little houses and some of the subdivisions within the houses. Now, at the museum, they've done a number of reconstructions of what the rooms would have looked like. You'll see that there's a ladder. Access was through the roof. There was a hatch in the roof. You went in and out through the ladder. You can see there's a lot of light coming in from the side. This is because, to show it off in the museum, they've left one side open. But in reality, all of these little houses are completely enclosed. There's no chimney even for the little stove oven. So it's really very smoky, very enclosed, very dark, except for whatever light you had. Here's another one. There are lots of bull's heads around in this site. There are platforms on which people presumably slept, and so forth. So this is one of the many artists' impressions of what this city looked like, this town looked like. At its height, you'll notice that people are moving around on top of the roofs of the houses, the rooms. Very interesting place. Keep that image in mind. Now, in 1963, Mellott's team excavated this level 7 of 18. which they dated to about 8,000 years before present. And in room 14, they found painted on the walls this very difficult to see mural. Here it is, preserved, taken out and preserved in the museum. And you can see a series of red little boxes, and there's something else above it. So let's go to a redrawing to make it clearer. So this is the redrawing of the mural, sort of trying to recreate what it would have looked like in the original setting about 8,000 years ago. And you see it's a number of squares in red, about 80 of them, forming a grid pattern in the lower register. And in the upper register, there's strange double-peaked thing, however Mennett described it, above. And this is what has been interpreted as being a map. Mennett said, now, he admits, by the time he starts writing this, the interpretation is always subjective. But it seems, he says, likely that the 80 or more squares drawn along the base in rows or terraces represent a view of a town. And one's only to compare figure 11 with plate 6a to see that this is indeed a possibility. And here is plate 6a in figure 11 compared. Each house has its own walls, and the internal divisions in the drawing remind one of the platforms, etc., in the plan. And one is struck by the variations and irregularities in the drawing of the individual houses. Therefore, he concludes, in our opinion, this is a representation of a Neolithic town, probably Çatalhöyük itself, the houses in which rise in exactly the same manner as is shown in the painting, in the mural. And then there's this thing at the top, which Mennett identified as being a profile view of one of the mountains, as you can see from the top of Çatalhöyük itself. Twin cones mark the position of Konya in the northwest, twin peaks crown the mighty mass of Karador, and in the far distance, one sees on a clear day the double cone of Hasan Dağ, then an active volcano and the highest mountain in the region. Here's a picture of Hasan Dağ, or Dağı. The G's got that little upside down circumflex that makes the president of Turkey called Erdogan, not Erdogan. Anyway, minor point. So here it is. And Mennett thought that the obsidian that is found at the site of Çatalhöyük came from this volcano. Hasan Dağ is about 120 miles from Çatalhöyük. And if you were walking it today with our physically larger bodies, longer strides, on metal roads, over bridges, it would still take you 38, 39 hours, at least as Google calculates it. So clearly a long distance away from Çatalhöyük itself. Mennett continues, arguing that Hasan Dağ was the source of the obsidian, from which these Neolithic peoples made tools and weapons, mirrors, and claims it's the commodity that they then exported. Later archaeologists have doubted the degree of economic activity, but again, that's not my area of expertise, so I'm not going to get into that. Here's one of the obsidian mirrors that was found at the site. This brings one to the spots on the mountain, the objects spurting out of the right-hand top, the cloud of dots and strokes above, and to the right of it, and the lines extending from the base of the mountain. All these, says Mennett, can be interpreted as the usual phenomena of a volcanic eruption. The rain of glowing volcanic bombs and red-hot rocks, the cloud of growing particles above it, and perhaps tongues of lava welling up from vents near the base of the mountain. Not that Hasan Dağ has any such vents. So Mennett is basically arguing then that this is a volcano, this is particularly Hasan Dağ, which is known to have erupted during the second millennium BC, and therefore there's only possibility, he says, that this is a highly relevant subject to be recorded in a shrine. And I'm just going to get ahead of myself here and say, for Menet, it's really interesting. It's a shrine because it's a mural, but then the mural is justified because the room is a shrine. There's a certain circularity to his logic. So, to all recap, Menet's argument is that the squares of the image look like the architect's own plans of this site. And so, therefore, these squares must themselves form a plan of the town itself. It looks like a map, therefore it is a map. The upper register is a realistic image of an erupting volcano, and therefore, made about 8,000 BP, this is clearly the oldest urban plan, the oldest scale map, and has been widely accepted as such. But is it a map? I should actually say, David Hackett Fisher, back in the 60s, wrote a book called Historians' Fallacies. And one of the first fallacies was, don't trust anybody who asks a question in the title, because what they really mean is the antithesis of the question. It's a very simple, silly logical fallacy. So I lay claim to that fault. Stephanie Meese, then a grad student at Cambridge, suggested in a paper in Anatolian Studies in 2006 that this is not a map. And it's fascinating because Meese bases her argument in large part upon the kind of interpretations that the History of Cartography Project has been promoting and facilitating, among other scholars, across the humanities and social sciences. And I'm drawing completely on her work. So none of this is on my own research. If I get into my own research, I'll go off on tangents and you'll be here forever, because it's such a cool topic I do, but I'll stick on this. So, first part of Meese's argument was that originally, if you read the accounts of the dig very carefully, originally Menet and his team thought that this was a geometric pattern and a leopard skin, that I'll explain in a minute. And only later, as their cartographer is actually drawing up the plan of the excavations in 1963, do they say, it's just like this map, therefore the mural is a map. One of the key issues here is there's a basic principle of interpretation. It's very hard in a prehistoric context to say something meaningful about an image because we have no context in which to put it. We don't have an archival record that will hint or explain what an image means and what it's about. Instead, we have to put each image into context of all the other images around the site, in this case. Works by the same people, the same community. And if you look across the entire site of Çatalhöyük, you find repeated geometrical patterns as a basic form of decoration, ritualistic symbol. Who knows what it's for, but there's lots of geometric patterns that are repeated. They cover large areas. Now this one's at least 10 foot wide. The designs, like the one on the left-hand wall of this reconstruction, they're a very key element in all these museum-based reconstructions at the site. Here is a mural interpreted as a human figure and running across it in sort of grey with a leopard skin. Leopards are a common motif at the site. Maybe along with the bull's head, some kind of a totem, some kind of sacred animal. Whatever it is, there's a lot of leopards depicted, either in mural form or in this case in some kind of bas-relief. So, following the basic principle of ethnographic interpretation when you're dealing with prehistoric materials, the mural seems to be just one more of these repeated geometrical patterns with a leopard skin put on top. Or maybe the leopard skin was there first and they put the geometric patterns below. Either way. And I just got to break off here for a great example of mansplaining. When I was looking for a picture of a leopard on Çatalhöyük, I came across this website in which some dude called Tristan Stringy Carter, who's an expert on chipstone tool, is seen as being the specialist to say, no, this is just a leopard skin, rather than giving credit to Stephanie Mies, who creates the whole argument and questioning whether there's a map or not. So this is sort of a typical academic thing, unfortunately. So, Mies's second argument is that the reference to Hasan Dor is wrong. So subsequently they did work on the obsidian found at Çatalhöyük, and they discovered that that obsidian does not come from Hasan Dor. Hasan Dor's obsidian is far too brittle to be used for shaping into tools, or mirrors even. Also, when Mies was writing, it seemed that the last time that the volcano had erupted was at least 1,500 years before the mural was painted, which would have put it right at the beginning of occupation of the site, 9500 BP. And then there's this problem. Here's the mural with the supposed volcano, and here's a side view of Hasan Dor. And you can see that the higher peak is to the right, except when you actually look at Hasan Dor from Çatalhöyük, the high peak's on the left. So it's not really, in that case, a truly realistic image. So the volcano is the wrong way round. The obsidian is wrong. It's not a place necessarily of great economic / religious significance to the Neolithic people of Çatalhöyük. So is this leopard, this is design in the upper register, really a realistic view of the volcano? Mies would say, no, it's leopard. And then we come to the point which is really the principle of the History of Cartography Project, which is to try to understand images based on the cultures that produce them, not upon our modern understandings of what maps are or what maps should be. And here Mies starts arguing that, well, first of all, she argues a very good point. Why should people 8,000 years ago make a map of their town in a style that's used only by modern-day archaeologists, and the modern-day archaeological plans don't have those roofs? They just have the remains of the walls. How would you show the plan if you were a resident there? How would you show the city if you're a resident there with all the roofs intact? You would think more of it as a different spatial conception involved. And why, for that matter, would a small town of 5,000 to 7,000 people need a map at all? This is like early modern European cities, which are called walking cities, where they have far more people, but very small, very cramped, and it's very easy to find your way around. And until really the 18th century, there are very few detailed plans of European cities even. Lots of views, I'll show you one later, but no detailed plans. The key issue here, and the issue that runs throughout the history of cartography, is that not only indigenous peoples and prehistoric peoples, but modern peoples as well, have made maps in various ways for various purposes. Even today, we have this idea that all maps are based on observation and surveying, but many are not. So the question is, why should we presume that people 8,000 years ago used modern methods, or at least adhered to a modern sensibility of direct relationship of the map to the world? And we can show that there's no necessary direct relationship in all sorts of images. Here's one of Bharat Mata, Mother India, from a 1958 textbook, where you see the outline of South Asia superimposed with a Hindu goddess. Or this one. Anybody have a clue what this is a map of? Anyone want to guess? Don't worry, my students are always stumped when I show them this one. If I showed you the next one in the atlas, you'd be really stumped. This is of the Mediterranean. It's from the 12th century so-called Book of Curiosities, now the Bodleian. And it's a wonderful document. The following map is actually a map of the Indian Ocean, and it looks almost identical. All those circles are just labeled island. Not because the Scot, well, he was a retired merchant who in his retirement decided to get the education that the nobles had, and so he taught himself or was taught geography and astronomy. It's not because they didn't know what the islands were or where they were or what they were called. It's that there's a certain philosophical approach that dictated it's more important to show the essence of a place rather than to show the precise geographical outline. And so in this case, the two rectangles, one is Crete, one is Sicily, they're actually discussed, and all the place names around the circumference are discussed. And if you go to the Bodleian website, you can find a wonderful website, detailed website, which has these images superimposed with translations, and it's just an incredible resource to have fun with. Or this map. This is a map of place from Arnhem Land in Northern Territories in Australia. It is the kind of work produced within certain Aboriginal societies for their own internal consumption. I can show this one because this was made to be given to a modern art museum at Deakin University. So it's legitimate for me to use this without constantly seeking permission from the artist and from the community every time I want to show it. There's a slight, the back of the alligator's or the crocodile's legs roughly is part of a bay, Caledon Bay, and the rest, we don't know. It's called crocodile and fire dreaming. The community knows what these symbols mean. It's embedded in a large oral tradition, and they're not telling us what it means. This Moshe landscape vessel from about 1000 CE in the Andes. Moshe were pre-Incan. So this vessel, which I believe is actually a Bowdoin College, is a map. The fox represents the constellation, often visible at this latitude, but also the god who supposedly protects this valley. The mounds around the edge are the mountains that surround the valley. In a sense, this is like topographical pottery. And so on. Or more modern, here's the Brown and Hogenberg view of Seville in 1572. And it's very stylized. We've got the staffage in the front. In this case, it's punishing a woman who'd been having an affair. She's been smeared with honey, so she's been attracting all the bees. And her husband, the cuckold, is the guy with the big horns, who's being mocked by everybody for letting his wife have an affair. And against this typical Spanish behavior, we have the city, and right in the center of the city is this great big tower, which is drawn far bigger than it actually really is. This is the Giralda, which is sort of like the Eiffel Tower of Seville or Big Ben in London. And this is the sort of the symbol of the city. You find it on all the tourist tat that you can buy in Seville, and you find it enlarged on every representation of the city. They say, this is the landmark. This is Seville condensed into one monument, and we're going to reproduce it. So even though it might look like a fairly sort of naturalistic, realistic painting, well, engraving with hand-colored, is actually covered in a great deal of cultural symbology. And when you start looking at maps, even scientific maps, you start to see this. So maybe I ask, with no reason other than, hey, maybe these bulls, which seem to appear all throughout the Çatalhöyük site, maybe they represent the city. Maybe they represent the community in some way. The other factor that Mies brings in is that, Çatalhöyük has no big public spaces. There are no public spaces. There are no big buildings. It's just domestic housing with shrines within the houses, but no separate churches or temples set aside, no granary for storing your surplus, which implies no government, there's no priesthood. But when you start to get large, complex societies, you start to get interesting scaled maps. So this one is from about 4000 BB, 2120 BCE. It's a statue of Gudea, Prince of Lagash, who had just conquered a huge area, what is now northern Iraq, and was building this huge temple to his patron deity. And this statue was going to go right next to the high altar. There's actually another one as well. And we know this because if you look around the skirt of the statue, it's covered in cuneiform writing, which tells you exactly what this statue was supposed to be used for and how it was going to be integrated into religious ceremonies and so on. And on the lap of this statue is this plan of a bounding wall, the wall that would have gone around the temple. And it even has, it's damaged on the foredge. There's another statue which doesn't have the plan, but it has, on the foredge of the lap, it has a scale for actual taking a measured approach to architectural construction. Or Nippur, 3500 BP, which this is part of city in southern Babylonia, and you can see against a modern map, you've got the Euphrates River coming down on the left, and various walls and constructions, all of which are nicely indicated with remarkable proportional fidelity in this stone tablet, clay tablet. It goes even further, though. We can look at urban maps that don't necessarily have a functional need. Here's the first map, later state, but the first map printed in Boston, second map printed in Boston, first urban map from 1722. And down in the lower left corner, you have a listing of all the great fires that have burnt down Boston at various times, and a listing of all the smallpox epidemics. And this was first published in 1722, the year after the great smallpox epidemic of 1720-21, which, now we're getting towards my area of expertise, which is a crucial moment in a lot of Massachusetts history. But this map is not so much, it's not a tourist guide. It's not a map to show people where to go. This is basically the north end of Boston, if you know Boston. It's a very, very small area. And if you don't know Boston at the time, and you went there, it was very easy to get directions. Just as you do on the street today. Hey, ask a stranger, where's so-and-so? They know. The map is more about, it's a celebration of survival, of having survived another major epidemic of smallpox, of having survived all these fires. And look, we are still built. We have these huge wharfs. We're still the center of New England culture. Finally, as I've already intimated, Mies also argued that Mellett's argument itself was very hypothetical and circular. When Mellett initially talked about this mural, he used words like subjective, it seems likely, terraces, rows, a possibility. There's a lot of fudging in that first report. In later books, he's completely assured this is a map. But that very first time, he was like, yeah, maybe, maybe not. And as I said, very circular in argument. The shapes could be terraces, and then justifies that attribution because the image does show terraces. The shrine, Rome is a shrine because of the mural, and what better place to put such a mural than in a shrine, and so on. And similarly, work on the volcano. There's been some work recently that says the volcano might have erupted at about the time this mural was drawn. There's a slip for you. This mural was drawn. And because the volcano did erupt, therefore, that is the volcano, therefore, that is the map. That just came out in the last couple of years. But I think Mies's argument is correct. When we think about why people make maps and why people use maps, this doesn't stand up as a map. It is just one more decorative mural. So the implications are very simple. All maps are constructed for reasons, for social reasons, and according to cultural conventions. Realism itself, in this sense, is a modern convention. And this is something that applies even to the most, quote, scientific products of modern technology, modern science. This is a USGS topographical quadrangle of Logan in Utah. And you'll notice, you've got a few pink area at the top, which is Logan. You've got some purple areas, which are updates from aerial photography. And then you have this huge swath of green on the mountain, on the Wasatch Mountains. And the question is, how do they get there? Who decides what is wooded and what is not wooded? And makes this very nice authoritative statement. Here be woods, here not be woods, Having done a wee bit of surveying in my past, not too much though, I can tell you, it is really hard to define on the ground where there are trees and where there are not. Do you define the trees by where the trunks are? Do you define the trees by the edge of the canopy? Are you going to spend your life in the field going, where's the edge of that tree? Oh, I see light. No, can't do it. It's way too hard. The USGS, like everybody else in Europe and around the world when they started doing this kind of mapping, started adding in layers of woodland, green for woodlands, once aerial photography was perfected. And so basically, some aerial photographic interpreter is looking at aerial photograph. He's got the drafts of the map, and he's looking at the photograph. There's big complex equipment, so it's not as simple as what I'm saying. He's looking at the photograph, he's sketching on the map, but he's still got to make a decision as to where there are trees and where there are not. That decision is simply this. In the interpreter's view, can the foliage at a given location hide an infantryman in full battle dress? If it can, it's green. It's a green dot. If it can't, it's not. So even basic natural phenomena are socially constructed in the same way that social phenomena are socially constructed. Anyway, the beauty of the History of Cartography Project has been to demonstrate the depth and the sheer importance of this insight in reinterpreting how maps are made, from the very earliest to the very modern. Thank you. Any questions? I don't know. Completely stunned you all. So.
What's the world's oldest map after all?
You know, I should have expected that. Well, I think that plan of Nippur goes quite way back, but even that's, well, actually the statue of Lagash is older. There are some property plans, again from Babylonia, that go back as well. But then, you know, so many of the early maps haven't physically survived. So in one of the Egyptian pharaoh's tombs, there's a great mural. It's relatively late, though, of land surveyors resurveying field boundaries after the annual flood of the Nile. Herodotus talks about this. Everyone quotes that. They then don't quote the following bit from Herodotus, which says, because this is important for taxation. They just think it's about, you know, where the fields, but little about taxation. So, absolutely, I mean, we go back, certainly into the ancient Egyptian. The Chinese have records that suggest not quite as old in terms of early printing, early mapping practices of whatever kind. But the Chinese were definitely printing maps well before anyone in Europe even had the thought. So it varies. Yeah.
The Chinese have recently told us that are trying to recall maps that are in the Netherlands. I'm thinking of the political purposes of maps. When did that start to be an issue?
Well, the first thing to realize is, and I haven't wanted to address this because this starts opening up a can of worms, but there's no such thing as the map. What we have are multiple different strategies by which people communicate, represent spatial information. And so you have to look at various contexts. So the political contexts of mapping are developed as people in some power are trying to communicate ideas to other people who are less powerful. Did that happen on the Egyptians? Maybe. There are public displays of maps in ancient Greece. Aristophanes talks about a big map put up in the Agora in Athens to display the world, and at the center was Athens. And a visiting peasant from outside the city, this is the humor factor in the play, this is in the Clouds. He looks at that and says, no, that's not Athens. That can't be the forum at the center of Athens. Why not, says the very worldly Athenian. Well, where are all the lawyers arguing? says the peasant. So the idea of mapping the world and putting yourself at the center is something that seems to be a universal process when people start to make maps of the world, of the cosmos. Such maps are also really not just about where the society is, where the culture is with respect to the physical world, but also with the divine. World maps are always, even today, really about not just the physical phenomena, but the noumena of our existence. So the politics of maps go back, I would say, to when we first had any kind of complex society with any kind of complex exchange. So,
hundreds of years, we have seen explorers discovering new worlds. Do they have an influence in creating maps or altering maps to suit their goals?
yes. So when you start getting in, especially into naval exploration, marine exploration, you get into a completely different kind of mapping, which is sea charting and stuff. But even then, in the early period, right up to about 1800, things changed in 1800 in all sorts of different ways. But before 1800, most exploration, actually most navigation, was not done with charts. Charts were used to give mariners an overall idea of a sea. But it's the processes, basically, of deductive reckoning, of keeping track of how far you've sailed, in what direction. Because how far is a basis of guesswork half the time. That's the deductive part, or the dead part if you get it wrong. So the charts get used, though. Europeans, as they start exploring out into the Atlantic, start to use the charts in the court circles, not for further navigation, but for the politicians to understand what's been found. And so the Portuguese, when they started going down the coast of Africa in the early 15th century, they thought, oh yeah, just send the ship down, they'll record the coast. They come back, great. They send another ship down, record the coast. You look at the two sets of data, completely different. Because you're dealing with very small boats that aren't setting into the shore very closely because you don't want to run aground in anything. And so you're looking out, and if you've been even a few miles out to sea, it's very hard to see details on the land. So the Portuguese finally realized that they actually got to use the map makers. So they go to Mallorca and they hire away a bunch of Spanish chart makers. There's this very specialist Jewish community in Mallorca making charts for the Mediterranean sailors. And they get hired away to go to Lisbon and make all the maps for the Portuguese. Fine. And then the Spanish get in the game. Columbus, And the Portuguese and the Spanish need to figure out how to separate their spheres of influence so they don't keep tripping over each other, which will lead to violence and maybe war. So the Pope intervenes, Alexander Borgia, and creates the Treaty of Tordesillas. There's a couple of treaties. But the 1498 Treaty of Tordesillas basically is a marine conception. Go to the Azores. Go to the Azores, go 300 leagues west, and everything beyond that is Spanish, everything this side is Portuguese. And so for the academics who think in terms not of marine sailing and distance and direction on a world that mariners know is spherical, but they just treat as being flat. As long as you keep doing it, it works fine. But the intellectuals want the world to be spherical. They want everything to be done in terms of latitude and longitude and the cosmography that they've learned because they're educated and they have to do everything in an educated manner. That's what separates them from the common mariners. So the guys at court then need to take this line drawn straight across the curved surface of the Earth, 300 leagues west of the Azores, and try to figure out where is that in terms of longitude. And then the real question becomes, where's the other side? When you get around the world, so when you go from the Spanish and Portuguese side, where are they going to confront each other on the other side? And that takes a diplomatic debate of about 150 years to solve. Partly because, I'm a bit jaundiced about lawyers, but, the lawyers made out like bandits on this one. They were well paid for a long time. So the charting by the mariners themselves may be politically minded, but it's when the the marine information gets back to shore and gets incorporated within bigger political diplomatic arrangements. That's when life gets interesting.
The logs you were talking about, I think, are called ship's rudders. Where you
Yes.
say, how do the naval cartography history people consider ship's rudders? Are they a kind of map? Are they a log but not a map? It's pretty cool how you brought that up, but I just wondered how you look at it.
Well, again, you see, it ends up lying into what use the rutters are being made, what use is being made of the rutters. A rutter is basically a pilot book. Rutter is a corruption, as the English always did, of the French routière, book of routes. In ancient Greece, these things were called periploi, a periplus, plural periploi. There's a periplus by Hanno, 3rd century BC, that goes all the way around Africa, for example. If that was being used by mariners, it is in effect a chart. It's a coastwise set of instructions for sailing. If you go in the 18th century, there's, for example, in the English tradition, there's a whole series of books called The English Pilot. First book of British Isles, second book Europe, third is around Africa to Asia. The fourth book is the North American navigation. So the fourth book, English Pilot, the fourth book, first published 1689, is published in multiple editions right up to the Revolution and a bit beyond, say 1780. It covers Labrador down to the Caribbean. Huge amount of emphasis put on St. Lawrence and the Bay of St. Lawrence and the Outer Banks for fishing. Huge amount of influence placed on the Caribbean for the sugar trade. And the main coast of North America is very skimpy because people are just going up and down the coast. Most of this book is like, AAA triptych, or the written instructions that Google gives you when you ask for directions. They often have little headlands scattered in. So as you go down the coast, basically the instruction is go down the coast until the headland looks like this, and then change your heading, and keep going down the coast until the headland looks like something else, the next image. And then you change heading, and you go on, and so on. And interspersed through these textual accounts and these little headland views are maps, or charts. And the fact that the charts are not actually used in navigation is evidenced by the fact that the same maps are repeated, are reprinted for the entire print run of the fourth book for over 100 years. And you can see them getting worn out. The impressions are getting fainter and fainter as the copper plate is being printed and wearing away ever so slightly each time. Until finally they get replaced with something that's not necessarily any better than what they were replacing. So it's one of the fun things about early marine mapping is the lack of relationship between actual navigation and the map. This changes with two things. When you start to have the ability to observe longitude at sea, which is both through the Harrison's chronometer, but that's not made accurately and cheaply enough for mass production until 1800. But also there's a wonderful technique, an astronomical technique, called the method of lunar distances, which of course the astronomers loved. So these two practices get used when the chronometers are cheap enough and when the lunar distances method is simpler. They had to really work to simplify it, take out all the repetition and the predictable stuff. And when everybody started to get trained in it, which again is not really till about 1795, 1800. So from 1800 on, you can expect certainly military vessels and many merchantmen initially to be able to fix their longitude. But then, it doesn't matter how well you know your longitude at sea. Latitude is easy. But if your charts are all wrong because they're made before people could fix longitude, then you're stuck. So fortuitously it happens that through the 18th century, there's a third technique for fixing longitude, the method of Jupiter satellites. The French, Giovanni Domenico Cassini, perfects about 1790. And so through the 18th century, there are observations on shore, because you've got to look at the moons of Jupiter as they're going around the body of Jupiter, and as they pass behind, it's called the eclipse of the moon, eclipse of the satellite. And you can predict when that's going to happen. So you got to see these moons going around, but they don't happen very often, and they have to happen at night when there's no clouds. And you stand on a heaving small ship with a 6-foot-long telescope trying to fixate on one distant point. You can't do it. So the method of Jupiter satellites was used only on land. But by the end of the 18th century, there's enough fixes with that technique that you started to get good coastal charts being revised at that point. And so the two technologies come together from different directions. And so in the 19th century, you get the modern practices of navigation, where the sea chart is an actual instrument used as part of the daily process, if not hourly process. But even then, you still got to have lighthouses and buoys and all those other instruments to go along with the charts.
Nobody else has a book. Since you mentioned 1800, I was astonished the first time I saw the map that Clark, Lewis and Clark guy, was able to make by 1810, based on the 1804 to 1806 expedition. What did they use to be able to get such, what to me are still astonishingly accurate maps, right at this time that you're talking about with naval maps? This would be on land.
They had, if I remember right, they had sextants with them, so they were doing lunar distances for longitude and latitude. But they also relied extensively on native knowledge. The team, both in the various parties when they did break up, when you're exploring over land or at sea, you only actually cover a very small area, very thin line. And the maps that they made coming back, after they got back, cover a huge area. So everything from about 5 to 10 miles on either side of their track, because they were going out 5 to 10 miles to hunt for food and stuff. So they got a good sense of that little track. But everything beyond that came out of native sources. And they were fitting it into an existing map. This is one of the other lessons of the history of cartography. Mapping is an innately historical process. You are constantly taking existing information and fitting more into it. And sometimes the results are completely bogus, and sometimes they result in greater accuracy. And if the processes you follow are appropriate, then you actually do get better maps and more accurate maps and so on. Other times you get the creation of whole mountain ranges out of almost whole cloth. That's a great story, but anyway. I could keep going on at length. So,
were globes started by marine navigation, or were they for political purposes, or both?
Neither. My job in Maine requires me to work with a donor very closely. He was a wonderful, wonderful man. But I rather scandalized him a few years ago when I said, I don't really study globes. You've seen one, you've seen them all. Because at least in the European tradition, there's some older globes. We know that the Greeks made some terrestrial globes. Strabo, about 10 CE, says, we make maps because to show stuff with great detail, you've got to make a really big globe, and that's just awkward. So let's make a plain map instead. So we know they made globes in the Greek period. And we have a celestial globe surviving from late antiquity, 4th century, I think it is, so-called Farnese Atlas. But as globes get picked up and used in early modern Europe, it is as a teaching tool. Globes are used to teach astronomy. Even terrestrial globes are used to teach people basic arithmetic, relationships in the cosmos. So you can calculate how long will the day be in 3 months from now for a given location. So that you can, in theory, regulate time to some degree, although sundials are much better at that. So what you start to find, there are a few globes. The earliest surviving European globe is Martin Beheim's so-called Erdapfel, Earth Apple, from 1493, about the time Columbus sailed. And that's just of the Earth. By 1600, about 100 years later, globes are being produced in pairs, a celestial and a terrestrial. And they're being produced with manuals explaining how to use these for teaching. So there are pictures of schools for marine pilots where they are standing at a table and they're looking at charts and they're looking at globes. But the pictures are all by landlubbers who don't necessarily know what the process is for actual teaching mariners. And as a result, I don't necessarily trust them. So globes themselves are really initially a pedagogic device. But then they also, terrestrial globes in particular, start to acquire cultural significance. They stand for worldliness. So if you see a painting in the early modern period of a gentleman posed with a globe, it's suggesting that they know something about the world, they're worldly. It's a symbol of vanity. It's a symbol of death. It's a memento mori, because this physical earth is destined to corrupt and decline because it's physical. And as any good Christian in the early modern period will tell you, we're just going to be worms and our true life will happen thereafter. So the globes appear in all sorts of places. And then by the 18th century, they also accrue not just worldliness, but domination of the world. So you start to see politicians and generals and admirals, nobles being posed with globes as a statement of power. And then it changes around about 1800. That mathematical system, the so-called doctrine of the spheres, by 1800 has completely, finally fallen out of favor. It's been declining over most of the 18th century. And the pairing of globes, the setting of globes as pairs, comes to an end. And as you move into the 19th century, there are more and more and more globes being made that are just a terrestrial globe without a celestial pair. And they're not in a big frame with a nice circle, the meridional circle, which you can rotate to get the right latitude, so you can do all these mathematical things with the globes. They get sold on a single fixed pedestal, and they're at one angle, 23.5 degrees, and that's it. And they then just become a strictly teaching tool, but strictly for just where our place is. So they're not really tied to navigation. Globes are really about teaching and displays of power.
Charlie Chaplin, great dictator.
Say again?
Charlie Chaplin and the Great Dictator.
Yes, yes. I almost had a still from that in the book that has just been published. And I can, if you want, I can wave it at you. It's called Cartography, the Ideal in its History. That is basically about the ways in which we have, in the modern post-1800 era, created the concept of cartography as a single process that obscures the fact that we continue to make maps in multiple different kinds of ways with multiple strategies that entail physical installations in the landscape, text, words, graphics, numbers, all these things we get to use in various ways for various ends. And I'll shut up.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.